Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the most critical battle for Canada's future was not being fought in the House of Commons or the Oval Office, but in the quiet marble halls of an Arabian palace? And can a single diplomatic handshake truly dismantle the leverage of a superpower intent on economic dominance? To answer these questions, we must look beyond the surface of diplomatic pleasantries and examine a seismic shift in global alliances that occurred in November 2025. We are analyzing a moment that historians may well look back upon as the definitive turning point where a middle power ceased to be a dependent neighbor and began to carve out its own destiny. Let's start by looking at the unprecedented reception that broke decades of silence. The story begins with an arrival that defied every expectation of standard diplomacy. When Prime Minister Mark Carney touched down in Abu Dhabi on the evening of November 18, 2025, the atmosphere was not that of a routine state visit. In the world of international relations, protocol is a language of its own. Usually, a visiting leader from a Western middle power might expect a polite reception, a photo opportunity with a foreign minister, and a quiet series of meetings that result in vague communiques about friendship and cooperation. This was different. This was, as observers noted, extraordinary. The United Arab Emirates, a nation known for its precise and symbolic approach to statecraft, rolled out a reception normally reserved for the leaders of superpowers. The royal leadership did not just welcome Carney, they received him. The distinction is crucial. He was treated not as a ceremonial figurehead, but as a global heavyweight whose presence was vital to their own economic strategy. Behind the scenes, away from the glare of television cameras and the prying eyes of Ottawa's nervous bureaucrats, the message delivered by the Emirati royals was unambiguous and transformative. Bring us the projects, we will bankroll them, and we will help you build the Canada that Donald Trump cannot control. To understand why this reception was so significant, we must appreciate the historical vacuum it filled. It had been 42 years since a Canadian Prime Minister last visited the UAE, a visit made by Pierre Trudeau in 1983. Think of the geopolitical chasm between those two dates. In 1983, the Cold War defined the world. The internet did not exist, and the Gulf states were seen primarily through the singular lens of oil exports. For over 4 decades, Canadian foreign policy had allowed this relationship to drift, relying almost exclusively on the comfortable guaranteed trade relationship with the United States. Carney's arrival ended that era of neglect, but the reception wasn't just about making up for lost time. It was a recognition of a specific moment in history. The UAE, with its hyper-awareness of shifting geopolitical sands, recognized that Canada was at an inflection point. They saw a G7 nation rich in resources and stability being backed into a corner by its closest ally. In the pragmatic calculus of the Gulf, a distressed asset with high potential is the ultimate investment opportunity. Carney was not greeted as a supplicant begging for charity. He was greeted as a partner who had finally arrived. The body language of the diplomats, the urgency of the scheduled meetings, and the immediate access to the highest levels of the royal family signaled that the UAE had been waiting for this. They had been waiting for a Canadian leader who wasn't just passing through, but one who was ready to do business on a scale that matched their ambitions. The reason for this unprecedented welcome was clear. The UAE saw in Carney a reflection of their own desire for strategic autonomy. They recognized that this was not a social call. It was a business transaction of the highest order designed to alter the balance of power in North America. Now we must address the Trump factor to understand why this pivot became essential. To understand why Canada suddenly turned its gaze to the Persian Gulf after 40 years of indifference, we must look at the storm raging on its southern border. The driving force behind this realignment, the why that propels every decision in this narrative, is the erratic and aggressive posture of the United States under Donald Trump. By November 2025, the special relationship between Canada and the United States had deteriorated into a campaign of economic coercion. The transcripts reveal a grim reality, crushing tariffs of up to 30% on most Canadian goods, with steel and aluminum facing levies of 50%. The Washington establishment assumed that Ottawa would fold. The expectation was that Canada, faced with economic strangulation, would beg for mercy, capitulate to American demands, and accept a vassal state status to preserve its trade access. But the Trump factor went beyond tariffs. It was the unpredictability, the annexation comments, the threats via social media, and the weaponization of trade borders that shattered the illusion of American reliability. For generations, Canada's economic strategy was built on the bedrock assumption that the U.S. was a stable partner. That foundation had crumbled. As political commentator Scott Reed noted, the U.S. had become a little less reliable than we had once imagined. This betrayal forced a psychological and strategic shift in Ottawa. The concept of friend-shoring trading primarily with ideological allies had become a liability when your closest friend decides to wage economic war against you. Canada was forced to pivot to anyone shoring. The logic was brutal but necessary. If the U.S. is going to turn away, if it is no longer a safe harbor for investment and trade, then Canada must look elsewhere. It meant that Canada could no longer afford the luxury of picking its dance partners based solely on tradition or proximity. The UAE understood this context perfectly. The royals are astute students of geopolitics. They saw that Canada and the U.S. were under unprecedented pressure from one another. They understood that the tariffs were not just taxes. They were political weapons designed to force compliance. The UAE's message to Carney was a direct response to this vulnerability. Let us help you build the mega projects that Washington expects you to fail at. Let us help you create an economic shield that Trump cannot penetrate. This is the core why of the alliance. For the UAE, supporting Canada wasn't about charity, it was about strategic positioning. By injecting capital into the Canadian economy, the UAE helps create a counterweight to American unpredictability. A stable Canada, fortified by Gulf wealth, becomes less susceptible to U.S. bullying. This aligns with the UAE's broader worldview of a multipolar world where power is distributed, not concentrated in Washington. The visit was an act of defiance. While Trump tweeted threats, Carney boarded a plane. While Washington expected surrender, Ottawa was executing a diversification strategy. The contrast was stark. One leader was burning bridges, the other was building the future. The Trump administration had calculated that geography was destiny, that Canada had no choice but to submit because it had nowhere else to go. They were spectacularly wrong. They failed to account for a world where capital is mobile and where other nations like the UAE are eager to step into the void left by American isolationism. Before we move on to the specific deals that made this happen, I want to pause and ask you, do you think this pivot away from the U.S. is a brilliant strategic move for Canada, or is the risk of alienating a neighbor too high? I would love to read your perspective on this critical shift, so please leave your thoughts in the comments below. This leads us to the pitch itself and how Carney matched capital with capacity. Why did the UAE open the vault? It wasn't simply because they disliked Donald Trump's policies. It was because, for the first time in a generation, a Canadian Prime Minister arrived with a pitch that made financial sense to the guardians of a $3 trillion sovereign wealth fund. The United Arab Emirates is the capital of sovereign wealth. These funds are not merely savings accounts, they are aggressive strategic investment vehicles looking for generational returns. For years, Canada had been a frustration to these investors. Previous governments were seen as timid, prone to shelving ideas, and paralyzed by endless regulatory delays. The UAE had looked at Canada and seen potential stifled by bureaucracy. They saw a country that didn't know how to say yes to big money. Carney changed the equation. He arrived in Abu Dhabi not with vague promises but with executable plans. He spoke the language of the Gulf scale, speed and strategy. His pitch was direct. You have lots of money. You want to put it into large-scale projects. You have not found those in Canada before. You will find them now. This alignment of Canadian assets with Emirati capital focused on three critical pillars: energy, infrastructure, and technology. First, energy and infrastructure. The UAE is actively trying to diversify its own economy beyond crude oil, but it still understands the value of energy logistics better than anyone. Canada presented plans for export infrastructure and strategic energy corridors, tangible concrete assets that generate revenue for decades. These are the kinds of mega projects that sovereign wealth funds covet because they provide stable long-term yields. Second, artificial intelligence and technology. The partnership extended into the cutting edge of the future economy. Prior to Carney's visit, the Canadian AI minister had already laid the groundwork, signing memorandums of understanding that paved the way for UAE investment in Canadian data centers. The UAE has the capital to build the physical infrastructure needed for AI, while Canada has the talent and the technological ecosystem. The pitch included technology transfer agreements and joint development of AI for healthcare, finance, and agriculture. This was a sophisticated play using Gulf money to supercharge Canadian innovation, creating a symbiotic relationship where Canada provides the brains and the UAE provides the brawn funding. Third, agriculture. This is perhaps the most understated but vital part of the pitch. The UAE is a desert nation with an existential need for food security. Canada is an agricultural superpower with expertise in precision farming and crop science. The pitch included joint ventures in sustainable farming techniques and water management. For the UAE, investing in Canadian agriculture is an insurance policy for their own survival. For Canada, it is a guaranteed market for its technology and produce. Carney's personal brand played a massive role in why this pitch succeeded. As a former governor of the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada, he is viewed in the UAE not just as a politician, but as a technocrat who understands the plumbing of the global financial system. The transcripts highlight that Carney fits perfectly into the UAE's world. He isn't preachy, he isn't moralizing, he isn't there to lecture, he is there to do business. This shift from Trudeau-era idealism to Carney-era hard strategy was the key that unlocked the door. The UAE values pragmatism and hard results. They respect leaders who negotiate quietly and deliver. Carney's willingness to bypass the moral posturing that often complicates Western relations with the Gulf allowed him to get straight to the economics. He presented Canada as a stable rule of law jurisdiction, a safe harbor compared to the chaotic U.S. that was finally ready to stop apologizing for its resources and start building. Now I want to focus on the Northern Pipeline, which serves as the centerpiece of this independence. Among all the discussions held in the palaces of Abu Dhabi, one project emerged as the meat in the sandwich, the definitive game changer that terrified Washington and delighted the Emirates: the Northern Pipeline Corridor. Why is this specific project the centerpiece of the entire strategy? To understand its value, we must look at the map. For decades, the vast majority of Canadian energy exports have flowed south into the United States. This physical reality gave the U.S. monopsony power. They were the only buyer, so they set the price and the terms. It also meant that if the U.S. decided to close the border or impose tariffs, Canada's energy sector would choke. The proposal discussed in the UAE was a pipeline corridor extending to the northern coast of British Columbia. This is not just a pipe, it is an emancipation proclamation made of steel. A project of this magnitude requires tens of billions of dollars capital that is hard to raise in Western markets, increasingly wary of fossil fuel infrastructure or spooked by regulatory uncertainty. But for the UAE's sovereign wealth funds, this is exactly the kind of generational build they seek. They are laser-focused on it because they understand the strategic implication. It bypasses the United States entirely. If Carney secures the financing for this corridor, Canada gains the ability to ship energy directly to Asian markets, Japan, South Korea, India, and China. It removes the American middleman. It reduces dependence on U.S. ports. It creates a direct vein from the Canadian oil patch to the global market. The transcripts describe this as a project that would permanently change Canada's negotiating power with Washington. It is hard to overstate how accurate that assessment is. If Canada has an alternative buyer and an independent route to reach them, Trump's leverage evaporates. You cannot squeeze a supplier who has other customers waiting at the door. The UAE's interest here is twofold. Financially, they get a stake in a lucrative energy supply chain. Geopolitically, they help facilitate a shift in global energy markets that reduces U.S. dominance. The discussions hinted at a memorandum of understanding between the federal government, British Columbia, and Alberta. This suggests that Carney was not just selling a concept, but a politically integrated plan using the promise of UAE funding to grease the wheels of domestic Canadian politics. The Northern Pipeline represents the physical manifestation of the economic shield. It is the tangible proof that Canada is serious about diversification. It transforms the abstraction of sovereignty into the concrete reality of export capacity. It tells the world that Canada is no longer landlocked by American policy. For the UAE, backing this project is the ultimate strategic play. It anchors their capital in a stable G7 democracy while simultaneously rewriting the energy map of North America. This visit also triggered a global ripple effect, establishing a new economic architecture. The visit to the UAE was not an isolated event. It was the first domino in a chain reaction designed to create a new economic architecture for Canada. The transcripts make it clear that Carney's strategy was to use the UAE as a launchpad for a broader global engagement that included a subsequent trip to the G20 summit in Johannesburg, South Africa. Why does this matter? Because it validates the anyone shoring strategy. The data cited in the analysis shows that this approach was already bearing fruit even before the UAE deals were finalized. In the 10 months prior to the visit, Canadian exports to Europe had increased by 22%, and trade with Africa had grown by 18%. These numbers prove that the pivot was not just rhetoric, it was a functioning economic reality. The UAE visit accelerated this trend. It signaled to other emerging powers, India, Brazil, the ASEAN nations, that Canada was open for business in a way it never had been before. If the conservative, calculated money of the Gulf was willing to bet billions on Canada, it served as a green light for other global investors. It marked the transition of Canada from a vulnerable neighbor of the U.S. to a diversified trading powerhouse. The broader implication is the creation of a non-U.S. financial pillar supporting Canada's growth. By securing capital from the Gulf and strengthening ties with the Global South, represented by the G20 in South Africa, Carney is assembling a network of partnerships that bypasses American volatility. This is the realignment mentioned by observers, a shift where Canada stops looking north-south and starts looking east-west. This strategy also has a profound impact on the domestic Canadian psyche. The realization that the world isn't small anymore, that there are dozens of time zones and thousands of partnerships waiting to happen, breaks the psychological dependence on the U.S. market. It empowers Canadian businesses to look beyond the border. The tourism data mentioned a 33% collapse in Canadian travel to the U.S., shows that this decoupling is happening at the citizen level as well as the state level. Ultimately, the UAE visit was the moment where diplomacy became dollars. It was the moment Carney stopped laying foundations and started cashing them in. By securing a signed investment pact, he didn't just get money. He got a vote of confidence from the global market. He proved that a middle power could stand up to a superpower, not by shouting, but by finding new friends with deep pockets. Finally, we must examine the domestic crucible and how Carney plans to turn crisis into execution. However, the grandest geopolitical strategy is worthless if it cannot be executed at home. For decades, the Canadian disease has not been a lack of resources but a paralysis of process. The UAE, along with the rest of the global investment community, knows this history all too well. They remember the projects that died in committee, the pipelines canceled by court challenges, and the timid governments that valued consensus over construction. This historical baggage is why the UAE's skepticism was initially so high, and why Carney's pitch required a radical new assurance that the rules of the game have changed. The brilliance of Carney's domestic strategy lies in his ability to use the external threat as a lever to break internal resistance. The Trump crisis is not just a challenge, it is a political weapon. By framing the U.S. tariffs and economic aggression as an existential emergency, Carney has created the political capital necessary to bulldoze through the regulatory gridlock that has historically strangled Canadian infrastructure. In normal times, a project like the Northern Pipeline would face years of environmental hearings, provincial bickering, and NIMBY not in my backyard lawsuits. But these are not normal times. The transcripts allude to a specific impotent mechanism, the assertion of federal jurisdiction over national economic security. The message being sent to domestic stakeholders and reassured to UAE investors is that when the national economy is under siege, local objections cannot veto national survival. The Memorandum of Understanding between the federal government, British Columbia, and Alberta is the smoking gun of this new reality. Historically, these entities have been at odds over energy policy. The fact that they are now aligning suggests that the threat of economic collapse has forced a truce. Carney is effectively saying to the provinces, we either build this pipeline and survive together, or we let Trump bankrupt us separately. This is the War Measures Act of economics. By elevating these infrastructure projects to matters of national security, Carney effectively bypasses the usual veto points. Environmental groups will undoubtedly challenge these moves as noted in the analysis, but the legal reality is that federal authority overrides provincial and private objections when the issue is framed as a defense of Canadian sovereignty. The UAE understands this distinction. They are not investing in permits, they are investing in a government's will to act. They needed to see that Carney possessed the ruthlessness to clear the path. Furthermore, this domestic shift fundamentally alters the risk profile for foreign investors. In the past, investing in Canada was seen as dead money capital that would sit idle while lawyers argued. Now, with the Trump emergency as the driving force, the timeline from handshake to shovel and ground is being compressed. The UAE's demand for executable plans is being met with a new federal assertiveness that prioritizes deliverables over rhetoric. Carney is not just selling a pipeline, he is selling a reformed Canadian state that has finally realized it cannot afford the luxury of endless debate. This internal revolution is the unspoken partner of the external pivot. It is the realization that to be a strategic power, Canada must act like one. It requires a government willing to spend political capital to burn red tape. The partnership with the UAE is the fuel, but the engine is this newfound domestic resolve. Without it, the billions of dollars from the Gulf would have nowhere to go. By aligning the provinces and asserting federal dominance, Carney is proving to the Emirates and the world that Canada is finally ready to move at the speed of global capital. As we conclude, we can see that this marks the dawn of resilience. As Mark Carney's aircraft departed Abu Dhabi on November 20th, 2025, it left behind more than just a diplomatic footprint. It left behind a signed roadmap for a new national destiny. The why of this historic visit is ultimately a story of survival and evolution. Canada was faced with an existential threat, an American administration that viewed trade as a zero-sum war and an ally as a target. The old playbook, quiet diplomacy, reliance on shared history, and waiting for the storm to pass was leading to economic ruin. The only path forward was to change the game. The UAE visit was the pivot point. It was the moment Canada stopped playing defense and started playing offense. By unlocking the trillions of dollars sitting in Emirati sovereign wealth funds, Carney secured the capital necessary to build the infrastructure of independence. By pitching the Northern Pipeline, he created a physical escape route from American coercion. By treating the UAE as a strategic equal rather than a piggy bank, he forged an alliance based on mutual geopolitical interests. This was not just about building a pipeline or funding a data center. It was about answering the question that Trump's aggression posed: does Canada exist as an economic entity independent of the United States? The answer delivered from the desert was a resounding yes. The collaboration between Ottawa and Abu Dhabi demonstrates that in a multipolar world, options exist for those willing to seize them. It shows that resilience is not found in isolation, but in diversification. The Trump strategy was to isolate Canada to force submission. The Carney strategy was to globalize Canada to ensure freedom. History will likely record this visit as the moment the umbilical cord was cut. The pain of the tariffs and the anxiety of the trade war were the labor pains of a new, more mature nation, emerging one that respects its geography but is no longer imprisoned by it. The UAE did not just invest in projects, they invested in the idea of a Canada that stands on its own 2 feet. And for a country that had spent 42 years waiting to return to the Gulf, the timing could not have been more perfect. The billions of dollars that will flow from this partnership constitute an economic shield, but the true value is intangible. It is the restoration of agency. It is the confidence that comes from knowing that when the closest door slams shut, the rest of the world remains wide open. Mark Carney went to the desert to find money, but he returned with something far more valuable: a future that Donald Trump cannot control. If you found this breakdown insightful and want to stay updated on how this geopolitical shift unfolds, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.